Hello, everyone. Today we have with us Webster, who's going to talk to us about Black History Month and his work with Quebec History X and uncovering Canada's Black history. So why don't you introduce yourself today?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. My name is Aly Ndiaye, aka Webster. I'm a hip hop artist. I started to rap in 1995. I'm one of the elders of the hip hop community in Quebec City. And I've been interested in history my whole life, especially about African history and African American history, because I didn't know there was an African Canadian history. I've studied history at the high school level, cégep, university, and I've never learned about slavery here and militancy and, resistance to slavery, but in an African Quebecois and African Canadian setting. So it's after university that I kind of stumbled on that history. And this is how I started to learn about it. And then I wanted to share it so that people would be able to know um, more about that history. So I started to rap about it. And then from rap, I started to give lectures. Then I built a guided tour. I've done exhibitions, books, podcasts, anything so that people could be able to get in touch with that rich history.
Fantastic. Okay. So as you've been digging through that rich history, as you've been uncovering it and learning the uniqueness of Canadian Black history, what are some common misunderstandings or misrepresentations that you've discovered about the history of Black Canadians?
Well, I'd say that the biggest misunderstanding is the narrative we built as
Mm,
a Canadian society as being a safe haven for the enslaved people from the United States who went through the Underground Railroad to seek refuge in Canada. So it happened, but that's not the only thing that happened. Like it happened in between the 1820s and until the Civil War in the United States started in 1861. So a couple, like tens of thousands came here, but we don't talk about what happened before slavery, We don't talk about the fact that we had our own slavery, and we don't talk about what happened when they arrived here. We
mm,
say like there wasn't no slavery, they came here and that's about it. Like they kind of disappeared when they crossed the border. But we don't talk about systemic racism. We don't talk about the obstacles. We don't talk about the fact that it was hard. There wasn't no slavery, but people had to fend for themselves. And there's another thing we don't talk about because our proximity to the United States enables us to feel moral superiority. Like, oh, slavery in the cotton fields, like that wasn't the same thing here. So it makes us feel better about it.
mm.
When we talk about segregation, we talk about Jim Crow laws in the United States, and it always seemed bigger, but we had our own segregation here too. But the thing is, we didn't have laws about segregation here for African Canadians because there were laws against the natives, like indigenous people. There were laws against Asians and Chinese people. But here, mostly there weren't no laws except one law to segregate schools in Ontario and another
Mm.
one in Nova Scotia. But mostly segregation was more into attitudes and the way things were going in society instead of being implemented through laws. So it's easy then to say, oh, segregation in the United States, that was so bad. But we don't look at our own segregations. Like there were places all over the country where, music halls, theaters were segregated. White people used to sit in the orchestra, and black
Mm,
people used to sit in the balcony.
mhm,
Balcony level in Montreal that was called the cage à singe, the monkey's cage.
mm.
And elsewhere in Canada it was called the crow's nest,
It's
you know?
awful.
Yeah, there were some hotels that wouldn't allow Black people to stay there. We have,
Mm,
in this case, in 1932, where Marian Anderson, the great African American singer, who was invited to perform at the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, but she wasn't allowed to stay at the Chateau Frontenac. She had to spend the night at the Clarendon next to the Chateau Frontenac. So she was invited to stay there, but
mm.
she couldn't stay there. And maybe 10 to 15 years later, she was invited back, but this time she was this international mega star, like today we talk about the Beyoncé's and Taylor Swift. She was the Beyonce and Taylor Swift at that time.
Yes.
So when she was invited, then she stayed at the Chateau Frontenac and she met with Maurice Duplessis. And so we had this form of segregation going on also until the 1950s, at least in Canada.
Mhm. So how do the projects that you do, you mentioned a walking tour, you mentioned exhibitions, how does that work aim to counteract these misrepresentations, this idea that Canada didn't have segregation or wasn't as bad as the United States? And maybe just take some time to describe those projects for us.
Yeah, so when I've started to learn about that history, well, I said it's not enough to learn about it. I want people to know about it
Mm,
because the one of the biggest misconception is to think that Black people have been here like since the second half of the 20th century. Like, my father arrived from Senegal in 1970,
mhm,
and in my youth, I've always thought that he was one of the first Black person in Quebec City. But you know that the first African to live in Quebec City arrived in 1629.
okay.
Quebec City was founded in 1608, and 1629, there's already that African presence, a young
Mhm,
boy by the name of, who received the name Olivier Lejeune. That wasn't his real name. It was his name that was given to him while being baptized. So
mhm.
I wanted people to understand that there have been people of African descent and Africans for centuries here. Something that even I was interested in Black history and didn't know about it.
Mm,
So to me, it enables us as a society to have a, a, a different look of our past, to understand that our past have been plural,
mhm.
for centuries. And then it gives us a different look of our present, and hopefully helps us build a better future. So
Yeah.
these are history that I would have loved to learn when I was young. So I started to rap about it because rap was the only way I had to communicate with people in my mid 20s. So I rapped about it. But then that wasn't enough because I wanted everybody to learn about it. So rap was a thing. But then I started to give lectures. But it's not everybody that wants to sit like for 2 hours at a time and listen to lectures. So, and that's okay. You have to respect the different ways of learning. So I've decided to put that guided tour together because people don't want to listen to rap or don't want to sit down on a lecture. Maybe they will want to walk,
Sure.
in the city streets and learn about it and then see the locations that witnessed that history. Because at one time I realized that history happens some places. It happens somewhere. And then I was like, oh, this is where it happened. And that guy, this is where he lived. And so I've put together that tour. So I was
Mm,
able to reach some other people. And then I've put together an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Quebec City, Fugitives, which was based on the ads in newspapers in the second half of the 18th century. Because here, since there weren't a lot of enslaved people, one of the only way to resist slavery or enslavement was through flight. People used to run away. There weren't enough people to take up arms. Like everywhere else in the Americas, people took up arms, they rebelled. But here, since there weren't a lot, well, flight became the main act of resistance to self-emancipate, to go against a system that would oppress you, and deemed you inferior. So when they ran away, they were advertised in newspapers, and they would describe what they were, what they looked like, some intellectual traits, some stratagems. So we don't have no pictures of people who were enslaved here. We don't have no engravings. Then those ads kind of become the most precise and precious documents about what they looked like. So I started from those ads and had them illustrated to show what those people would have looked like, and then to give a human face to people dehumanized by slavery, And then it was a way to celebrate resistance to slavery. Because as we say, you cannot talk about slavery without talking about resistance to slavery. Because those people, they weren't just slaves, they were enslaved. They were people, and many of them resisted in different ways, but they resisted. So to me, it was a way to kind of veer off the narrative that people were just slaves and just, bearing the brunt of slavery. They resisted. And this is what I wanted to show through the Fugitives exhibition. And then there was a different way to teach about that history, so you don't only have like a big canvas and then beside it you have the ad. So it's quite simple. So I didn't want it to be too complicated. So to be able to reach a lot of people, and even young kids, you have like 5 or 6 years old who maybe don't understand the concept, but they see African Canadians, they see Black people dressed in the ways of the past. So then they are able to understand that there's been this presence here for centuries. Even though they might not understand slavery, they might not understand what was happening with them, but then they'd see Black people in old-timey clothes,
Yeah, and an image can be so powerful. So just keeping it simple, I can imagine, could really speak to people. And like you're saying, seeing Black people in old-timey clothes in Canada just goes to show the presence.
Yeah, exactly. So these are different ways to teach that history because, like books exist about African Canadian history. There are books and more than we might think. But it's not everybody that wants to read books. And they are not often, these are still really kind of academics, like big books, which are quite interesting, but it's not everybody that wants to read them.
Sure.
So we kind of don't have a bridge to give access to that knowledge. It's like you're either like a fan of history and you read those books, or you don't, and you're not able to connect with that history. Some other places, like let's say in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Brazil, well, you have this in between, you have the academic research, but then you have plays, movies, series, children's books, you have fictions that talk about that history. So people are able to learn about it, they're able to relate to it, even though they're not specialists, So here in Quebec, and even well, I think it's different in Nova Scotia and Ontario, where they are more connected to that history. But here we lack this bridge to be able to gap, that knowledge and the people in general. So this is what I'm trying to do with those different endeavors.
Mhm. And can you tell me, during this research process or even the illustration process for the exhibition, was there anything that you discovered that really surprised you?
Uh, well, a lot of things surprised me because I, just because I learned, so I learned that, oh, this guy was living there. Oh, this is what that person did. Oh, this is how they resisted. This is like just 2 days ago, I was reading, like I was finding newspapers clippings about a man. His name was Professor C.A. Johnson from Hamilton.
Okay.
And this guy would tour North America. He would go to Montreal, to Toronto, to Buffalo, to New York, to Indianapolis, and he would give lectures about science.
Hmm.
But this guy was crazy. He was crazy. He would talk about the inhabitants of Mars being 25-foot tall with wings, and would talk about like some crazy science thing, he would say anything, but would dress it in a scientific vocabulary,
Sure.
It would get money out of it, and you just read about the how they would talk about in the newspapers, and that was so funny. So this guy was just conning people out of their money by spewing pseudo-scientific vocabulary. So that was just, but then you would read about him, and then there's something that would make sense. I would
Mm.
say, and that was like at the end of the 19th century, so 1890s, the start of the 20th century, and say, soon people will travel in the air. They will travel through electricity. And
Hmm.
I've invented this vehicle which is 100 feet wide, and everybody will be able to be in it, and don't worry about it. And life came from water, which makes sense. And that guy, that's fascinating. So it's just little things like that I find so interesting, that always surprise me.
Yeah, and I can imagine reading accounts of people who are so human, whether that be because they're conning people by doing pseudoscience or also having ideas about science way ahead of their time. It just fleshes out people who are dehumanized, who were dehumanized in the process of slavery, which is so essential for us to understand our history, that these people were full, rich people with full lives. So I really commend you for that work.
Yeah, well, thank you. And you're right, because we often talk about the past and Black people in the past, let's say as victims of
Hmm.
slavery, but they were bandits too, they were con men, they were complex. There wasn't like monochrome, there wasn't a monolith. Like you had so much diversity inside those communities.
Hmm.
So you had fraudsters and conmen and bandits and criminals, and you had some good people too. You had victims of slavery, you had people who resisted slavery, you had preachers, you had intellectuals. So when we talk about the past, we often talk about like W.B. Du Bois, and we talk about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, which are great people.
Of
But
course.
then there were some other people, questionable people, which are part of history also.
Of course. And so, how has rap and hip hop provided you an avenue for also expressing and exploring these ideas?
Well, I feel that hip hop gave me a way to express myself.
Mm.
Like I've done so many shows that when I step on a stage in front of a crowd, I talk about history, but I rap history. The way I talk about things, the way the information flows out of my head, well, it's closely linked to hip hop. It's closely linked what we've been doing for 30 years now, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But also it gave me, how could I say that? Courage. It gave me a sense that, you know, we've been marginalized for so long. We've been doing our things by ourselves for so long. Now I'm like, you know what? Whatever. I do it. You want it? Fine. You don't want it? Fine. You know? So it gave me the kind of it freed me, you know,
Mm.
from how people would think about me or what I'm saying, you know, because everything I say is verified and verifiable. You know, you can verify what I'm saying every time, you know, it's there. So I don't care about what you think.
Mm.
You know, I don't care about what people might think about what I'm saying because I've done my research, you know. Now we use that term now in a different setting, you know, with the COVID and stuff like that. But history-wise and Black history-wise and Canadian history-wise and Quebec's history-wise, I've done the work. I still have a lot to learn, you know, as we're always learning.
Mm-hmm.
But everything I say, you can verify it by yourself. So I don't care about what might be said, what people might think about what I'm doing. And I feel it's closely linked to hip hop and the mindset of hip hop.
Mm. That's fantastic. And just before we wrap up, I want to know, is there anything else that you want people to know about for this upcoming Black History Month or just Black history in Canada? Anything that's on your mind or events that you'd like to discuss?
No, I think that we've we've said what had to be said. Maybe like, you know, we always talk about Black History Month, but we're Black the whole year, you know. So
That's
we
true.
can talk about Black history in January or June, September, and not just confine it to February, you know, the coldest and shortest month of the year, you know. So the thing is, it's cool to talk about it, but then we have to celebrate African Canadian history and Black history the whole year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. We are so grateful at the CFFM for hearing from you, and this has been such an educational discussion and just so important to, if we're going to make reconciliation with our country's past, we have to discuss the truth of our history and
Right.
see it up front. So I thank you so much for your work and
Thank you.
also for this really edifying conversation.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.